This happened back in 2005, when I was 18 years old. I was living in Uvalde, Texas, in a pretty rundown neighborhood, like a lot of rural areas in Texas. The closest city to me was San Antonio, and I was studying at a local community college since my family didn't have much money. One of my best friends from high school, Andrew, had moved to San Antonio to study at San Antonio College. He lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of town with another guy, and his girlfriend often stayed with him, too. He invited me to spend a night over at his place, so I decided to take my old truck and drive out there. Now, my truck was a 1995 model, a real piece of junk. To be honest, the fuel gauge didn't work, so I always had to remember when I last filled up and make sure to refuel before it ran out. I headed down Highway 90, which goes straight from Uvalde to San Antonio, around 3 p.m. on a Friday. Traffic was light, and I got there without any problems. Andrew's girlfriend was set to arrive the next day, so that evening we hung out at his apartment with his roommate, then headed to a nearby place. By the time we got back to the apartment, it was around 2 a.m. After a quick meal, I crashed on the couch. The next day started off pretty much the same, except that Andrew and his girlfriend had been arguing all day, and by nightfall, things had only gotten worse. She began yelling at him right in front of me, and it became really awkward. I was already feeling hesitant about spending another night there. I finally decided to head back home, said goodbye to everyone, and started my drive back. It was late, probably around midnight. Highway 90 was empty at that hour, so I figured I could speed up a little by my truck standards. Then, out of nowhere, the engine started sputtering. My heart sank as I realized I had forgotten to refuel. I slowed down, but the engine gave out completely. I pulled over to the side of the road and tried starting it up a few times, but no luck. I pulled out my cell phone, which, like my truck, was in bad shape, and tried to get a signal. No luck there either. All I could do was turn on my emergency flashers and hope someone would pass by. I can't tell you how long I sat there, stranded, before I saw a pair of headlights in the distance. I waved my hand as the car got closer, but it passed me by without slowing down. 10 minutes later, another car did the exact same thing. I was starting to lose hope, thinking I might have to spend the night in my truck and wait until sunrise for help. Just as I was about to settle in, I heard the sound of a car door closing behind me. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw a truck parked behind me, headlights on. I turned around to get a better look, but I couldn't see anyone inside or outside the truck. I got out of my truck and called out, "Hello," but no one answered. I thought maybe someone had stopped to help and stepped into the woods for a moment, so I walked closer to the truck, hoping to find someone. After a few moments, I gave up and went back to my truck, locking the doors. It felt strange. Suddenly, there was a light tapping on my window. I jumped, only to see a man staring at me through the glass with this unsettling grin on his face. He said, "Hey, friend. Need some help?" I rolled down the window just a bit and replied, "Yeah, I ran out of gas." The man nodded and said, "That's a problem. Come on, let's take care of it." For a moment, I thought he meant helping me get a gas can to fill up the tank. I got out, expecting him to lead me to his truck, but instead, he just stood there, still grinning, saying, "I need to check your pockets, please." It took me a second to realize what he meant. I was a broke college student driving an old truck with no cash, and my phone was dead. I wasn't about to let this guy rob me of the little I had. I took off running toward the woods. I may not have been big, but I was quick, and I noticed he was chasing me. As soon as I reached the trees, I started zigzagging to throw him off and eventually hid behind a large tree to catch my breath. While I was hiding, I heard footsteps getting closer. I held my breath as he called out, "I'm gonna kill you, you hear?" I didn't know if he meant it or if he just wanted to scare me, but I was terrified. I stayed there, frozen, even after his footsteps faded away. I didn't move at all for the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, I went back to my truck, only to find that the mysterious truck behind me was gone, and someone had opened my glove compartment, taking anything valuable. They'd even stolen my fleece jacket, which had something in its pocket. Eventually, I flagged down a passerby who was kind enough to give me a ride to the nearest gas station. I bought a gas can, filled it up, and he drove me back to my truck, where I refilled the tank. Then, I headed straight home. That experience taught me that there are people out there who will try to take advantage of you when you're in a vulnerable spot, but there are also kind people, like the guy who helped me out. At 18, I was immature and inexperienced, a bit of a troublemaker on the road. I'd sometimes cut people off and glance back at them just for fun. It was pretty dumb, honestly, and if I ever have kids, I'll definitely be stricter about their driving habits. Despite my age, I did a lot of driving. My university was a good 5-hour drive from home, and the traffic near my town was always horrible, no matter the day of the week. To avoid it, I'd always leave at night during breaks, which shaved my 4 to 5-hour drive down to around 3 hours. It was the start of winter break, and fall semester had just ended. All my friends left on the same day, but I waited until late at night because I hated driving in traffic. I drove a Mazda 3 and, honestly, I was infamous for keeping it just about empty. People would comment on it whenever they rode with me, and I'd assure them the car could go at least another 30 miles after hitting empty. Well, that night, on my way home, I learned I was wrong. I was halfway home on the highway when the fuel gauge hit E, but I thought I could make it to the nearest gas station. My car suddenly started making weird noises, then slowed down. That's when I realized I was actually out of gas. I managed to pull off the nearest exit, hoping it'd lead to a gas station. The exit was dark with no streetlights and thick woods on both sides. I didn't want to lose speed, not knowing if I'd have enough gas to reach a station. I coasted through the stop sign at the end of the ramp and onto a road that was just as dark and surrounded by trees. Eventually, my car gave out completely. Worse still, when I checked my phone, there was no signal. My service was with T-Mobile, which is terrible anywhere outside a city. I even tried calling 911, but obviously, without reception, it didn't work. I was pretty scared and had no idea what to do. I turned on my hazard lights and waited, hoping someone would pass by. It took a long time, but finally, I saw headlights in the distance. I flashed my lights to signal for help, and the car drove by, then made a U-turn and parked on the grass behind me. I had no idea who was getting out of that car, and here I was, an 18-year-old girl who couldn't defend herself. I cracked the window a bit when a man came up to my car. I told him I needed help because I'd run out of gas. He was a bald guy wearing glasses, and he looked trustworthy enough. With no other options, I accepted his offer to help. I got out, locked my car doors, and followed him to his car, a black Honda, probably from 2010. There was a weird smell inside that I couldn't quite place, but then I heard something thumping from the back. At first, I thought it might be from rough driving or something loose in the trunk. The guy kept talking non-stop as we drove, and finally, we reached a spot that looked more populated. A few lights and buildings were visible up ahead. I saw a restaurant and some small houses. We stopped at a red light at the first intersection, and for the first time, there was silence. Suddenly, I heard it, a person yelling from the trunk, followed by loud banging. I looked over at the guy, and he glanced at me. Without a second thought, I undid my seatbelt, threw open the door, and ran just as he tried to grab me. I heard him get out of the car, but then he rushed to shut his passenger door and jumped back into the driver's seat. I heard the engine rev up as he sped off. I ran to the restaurant, asked for help, and used their phone to call the police. I waited there while multiple squad cars arrived, and the whole place turned into a scene. Given how serious my report was, that I'd heard someone screaming from his trunk, the police had to get every detail about the car, his appearance, and the exact location where he picked me up. They also helped me return to my car so they could document the pickup spot. They arranged for roadside assistance to finally fill up my gas tank, too. It was, without a doubt, the most terrifying experience of my life, and I was genuinely scared the entire time. I hope they found that guy, and that whoever was in his trunk is alive today. For all I know, that man was planning to take me somewhere, maybe even his house, and I was incredibly lucky to escape at that red light. I live in Burke County, North Carolina, in the quiet town of Morganton. I'm used to the peaceful, rural lifestyle here. Sometimes you run into odd characters, but it's usually nothing too bad. My husband and I have a nice piece of land, and I work shifts that sometimes change between days and nights. One night, I was heading home from a late shift around 3 in the morning. My phone battery was nearly dead, and I was tired and hungry, looking forward to just grabbing a bite and getting home. I stopped at a gas station, bought $10 worth of fuel and a pre-packaged sandwich, and decided to eat in the station's cafe area. While eating, I noticed a suspicious-looking man eyeing me. He didn't buy anything and eventually left. After eating, I went out to fill up my car. For some reason, the smell of gasoline was really strong. The roads around here are dark and winding at night, so I drove slowly, especially since it had been a long day. Then something unexpected happened. The gas gauge suddenly dropped to 0, the low fuel light came on, and I heard a beeping sound. I had no idea what was happening, especially since I had just filled up. I'm no car expert, and I've never run out of gas before, so I thought maybe it was a glitch. I pulled over, restarted the car, but the gauge still read empty. I tried driving a bit further, but the engine stalled. Starting to panic, I called my husband, grateful that he answered. I asked him why my car stopped right after refueling, and when I stepped out of the car, I noticed a very strong smell of gasoline. He said it sounded like I had a fuel leak and told me he'd come over right away and call roadside assistance. As I was on the phone, I heard a car approaching with its lights off. It suddenly stopped not far behind me. My mind flashed back to the suspicious man at the gas station, and I asked my husband if it was possible that someone had tampered with my car. His tone turned serious, and he said there was a chance someone had cut the fuel line. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I knew I had to get away. I grabbed my car keys, locked the doors to turn off the lights, and told my husband I'd message him when he was close. With only about 2% battery left, I sent him my location and then ran off the road toward the nearest house. I sprinted up the long driveway and rang the doorbell multiple times. Finally, a man in his 60s, who looked like he'd just woken up, answered the door. I briefly explained my situation and asked if I could come in to hide and charge my phone. He let me in, and I asked for an iPhone charger, which he went to look for. He told me to sit in the living room, and I sat there in my scrubs, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Then, from the kitchen, he called out asking if I wanted some water. I replied yes and saw his reflection in the mirror as he filled a glass. I watched him drop something into the glass before he moved out of sight. The faucet was still running for a while before he shut it off, and then he returned with the water, handing it to me. I thanked him but didn't drink it. He asked me to explain my situation again, and I told him I just needed a charger to contact my husband. He said he'd check upstairs, so I used the last bit of my phone's battery to share my updated location with my husband, just in case. I sniffed the water. It didn't smell unusual, but I was almost certain he had spiked it. When the man returned from upstairs, he said he didn't have an iPhone charger, only one for his Android. At that moment, I stood up, walked straight to the door, and left. As soon as I was outside, I ran down the driveway back toward the road. I used my remaining phone battery to update my location once more, just as it was about to die. I waited until I finally saw my husband's truck lights and flagged him down, feeling overwhelming relief. When we got back to my car, the vehicle that had been behind mine was gone, but the back window was shattered. Someone had broken in but hadn't found anything valuable to steal. The car battery was also dead. When I told my husband about the man at the house who had likely tried to drug me, he was furious and wanted to go confront him. But I convinced him to wait until roadside assistance arrived. Eventually, my car was towed to a repair shop, where they confirmed the next day that my fuel line had indeed been cut. Thankfully, I got a few days off work afterward to recover, because mentally, I was still shaken. The thought of nearly falling victim to two different suspicious men in one night was something I couldn't easily shake.